I'm going to mute everybody else. It just reminds you that the chat box is at the top of your screen. I think it's the second icon from the left. I'll be monitoring that as well as Karen. Some of you may have heard at the top end of the call there, I've got my kids home with me tonight. I'm single parenting. I wasn't supposed to be facilitating this call, so I apologize if there's a little bit of noise. I will do my best to keep them quiet. But Karen knows I may have to step away to put them to bed. We'll do our best to keep this as professional as possible. And I am going to record. I'm going to mute. And I'm going to pass the presenter over to Karen.
Hello. So just making sure that you can hear me. So maybe an indication that it's going okay by at least one person. That would be great.
I can hear you, Karen.
Okay, that's a good start. Okay, so welcome to tonight's webinar. And the topic that I've been asked to present on is competition fatigue management, what works and what doesn't. And it's something that I know that is important for coaches and for athletes because competitions in curling can be quite long, longer than many other sports. We go for sometimes 10 days in a competition with multiple games per day. And so this is a particular issue for curling that I think is even more important for curling than it is for other sports. So I'm just going to close that chat box. So Jen, I've closed the chat box just so I can see my screen better.
I'll keep an eye on it for you.
Yeah, thank you. So the first question is, what is fatigue management? What are we talking about? And I want to, there. So the first concept that we're going to be talking about is how to recover from the effects of exertion. How do we work with the athletes to assist the body to recover from exertion? So recovery is the process of returning to a normal condition. And that can vary from athlete to athlete. So there's no one method for designing a fatigue management plan. Each athlete is unique. And you may have a team where you have one athlete that has totally different needs in terms of fatigue management than another athlete, which makes it more challenging. It can take anywhere from minutes to hours to days, depending on the amount of exertion, depending on the situation that you're in terms of the other things that are going on, and depending on the frequency of the competition. So a competition that lasts several days and has 2 or 3 games per day, the recovery time is going to be shorter. And so what you can get in terms of the minutes that you can, what you can do in minutes and hours and days is going to be different. The days you may have to wait for between competitions because you just have time in minutes and hours between games. So it's going to vary. So we're going to talk about all those scenarios through this webinar. So what does the term recovery mean? What is the science of recovery? One of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that it's not just about feeling rested or feeling okay or feeling normal. It's also the internal parts of their system that you don't actually see, like how much carbohydrate and fat stores do you have, how healthy is the immune system and the endocrine system, how much protein is available to help repair muscles. Those are things we can't see and feel. And so it's a lot harder to measure than just, how tired am I today or how tired I am after a game. And so because it's invisible, it's more of a mystery in terms of how to judge whether it's going well and how to help improve it. And one of the key things that science has showed us about recovery is that the first 2 hours after exercise, the focus is on muscle and carbohydrate and protein synthesis, so muscle repair. And the reason why it's so important in curling is sometimes we only have 2 hours between games. And so how much repair can start to happen between games is important in order to go out and do the next game without draining the system over time. So what works best? Well, oh, so I have to, sorry, I have to allow somebody, I'm allowing somebody to join. What works best? The first thing is that there be an overall plan. We're going to focus today mainly on the competition period, but what really works best if fatigue management and rest and recovery is looked at over the season. So what can athletes do in advance of a competition to put them in the best space that they can be in to be able to manage fatigue during the competition? What can be done in the taper plan and the travel plan that contributes to a more effective fatigue management plan during the competition? And then, of course, during the competition plan, what specific guidelines are outlined for things like a meal plan and a rest plan? And then after the competition, what will allow that athlete to get back to their everyday life, whether it be a full-time job or whatever, or going on to the next competition? What kinds of activities are going to be useful in terms of managing the fatigue from that competition and then getting into preparing for the next competition? You'll see the word plan is mentioned many times on that slide, and I think that if you go away with nothing else, that's the key message. So my screen seems to be frozen. Oh, there. So the best practices long-term are to talk about rehab and rejuvenation. And we'll talk about that at the end, but that's really what you would be looking at between competitions, not during a competition. So the rehab is what's done when you have the time to do rehabilitation, and then rejuvenation is how you start to get ready for the next competition. For today's focus, I would like to focus more on what are the best practices during a competition. And so I'm calling that acute recovery because it's that recovery period that you have between games or overnight before the next game the next morning. So the topics we're going to talk about today are repair, refuel, rehydrate, rest, and reheat. So what's the purpose of repair? It's the most important element, and one thing that you'll notice as we go through this is that each item is interrelated. So part of repair is looking at how you refuel and how you rehydrate and things like that. But repair in itself is trying to reduce the soreness, prevent the illness, and increase the performance. So I know that none of this is new to you, that you're already encouraging athletes to do this, to do things like cool downs. It's part of our standard protocol, and to refuel and rehydrate. But the point is that if you have more information about the theory behind why this is important and you're able to explain that to athletes, or if you're athletes yourself, I'm sorry, I don't know how many of you are athletes yourself. I know many of you are coaches. But if you know the theory behind why these things are important, then it's more likely that it'll be taken seriously and done every time. So we'll talk more about the refuel and rehydrate later as topics on their own. And I think I want to emphasize that what's best for one athlete might not be best for another. Some athletes can get in the practice of icing their muscles after every game, especially if they've got an area that they were rehabbing or prehabbing before the event. That would be something to pay attention to. Anything that's sore that becomes an issue right away, or becomes a minor injury or an irritation during the event, ice is the best thing to provide on the short term. So it's that old thing to ice something within the first 24 hours is important. And sometimes athletes can really benefit from icing even though they're not sore. So they can't see the internal tears that have happened to their muscles while they've been sweeping heavy during a game, but they're happening anyways. And if you start icing after the first game, maybe you're not sore after the fourth game. The alternating hot and cold water immersion is something that's very effective in terms of increasing blood flow to the area. So there's a picture here of a bucket of ice. this is actually the best way to do it, is to submerge in a bucket of ice that's got water in it, because the ice transfers the coldness to the water, and it's actually a much more effective way of cooling the part of the body that's sore. Now, not all parts of the body are easy to get into a bucket of ice water, but it is something that can be done in a hotel room quite easily with the ice machine that's in the hotel. And so the idea is that you do 30 minutes, not 30 minutes, don't do 30 minutes. You do 30 seconds of ice to 1 minute of hot. So if you've got a magic bag you can warm up in a microwave, and you've got a bucket of ice, you do the bucket of ice for 30 seconds and the magic bag for 1 minute. And you would repeat that for up to 10 minutes, and then take a break and do it again after the next game. This is the really good way of increasing the blood flow and removing toxins from the area where there's soreness or injury. And then following immune boosting strategies and listening to your body. So here's some examples of the cool down. Just going over this, I know most of you are aware of this, that the advantages to the cool downs are partly to increase flexibility, partly to remove the toxins that can come from the lactic acid buildup in your muscles during exercise, and partly to get your heart rate down to a reasonable level so that you're giving your body a chance to rest more quickly. So a good cool down will help the whole body move from exertion to repair faster. So it's you know, if you had a whole day to take a break and not have another game for another 24 to 48 hours, these kinds of activities wouldn't be as important. But because you only have a few hours to start the repair of the muscle and rebuilding of the muscle, that's why these activities are so important during a competition. So immune boosting is something that I could do a whole webinar on, and I'm just going to touch on it here. But it's an important activity during the competition. It's something that I think, I don't know how many, I'm trying to think if I've ever gone to a competition where somebody didn't get sick, either with a cold or some kind of upset in their stomach. It's so important to performance that the immune system be strong. Now, some of these things that are listed on the slide, like getting vaccinated, you're not doing during the competition. You're going to do before the competition. We are recommending, this is through the doctor that works with the National Team Program, is recommending that athletes be vaccinated for the flu vaccine every year. And again, this is a personal choice. It's a recommendation from our team doctor. And the reason for that is that it's just another step that can be taken to help prevent the severity of the illness if the athlete gets the flu. It does not prevent the athlete from getting the flu, but when they get the flu, or if they get the flu, it will help them get back into the game faster. Avoiding the germs is always something that we've been talking about for a long time, especially now that we've, the athlete is in a competition, they're being exposed to people in the arena, to the public who wants to meet and greet people, to other participants who may have colds or may have brought things with them. But as well, you're in an arena environment, the air is being recirculated, you're not getting as much fresh air as you would normally get on an average day. So there's all these things working against the athlete in the competition environment. Shaking with gloves on, we are seeing more often now, doing elbow bumps, fist bumps. Fist bumps are actually less transmission of germs than a handshake. So a fist bump, if you're not comfortable with the elbow bump, is considered now to be a very acceptable way of avoiding germs. And then, of course, with all athletes, making sure that for sure they either keep their hands away from their mouth or that they wash their hands religiously, if I can use that term, before eating any food or putting anything near their mouth. The supplement diet is one where it can mean both taking supplements, which is where I come in with my hat on for doping control, but it also can mean just supplementing the athlete's diet, especially during high stress times like a competition, with foods that are known to be immune boosting. So for instance, citrus foods that are known to be high in vitamin C are very good in supporting the immune system. Other kinds of vegetables like broccoli and things like that that are very high in vitamin C are also considered immune boosting. So supplementing the diet can mean making sure that it's not just the arena diet, making sure that it's a diet that has immune boosting qualities to it, and that the athlete isn't just eating quick processed foods, but is eating healthy whole foods that are rich in vitamins and minerals. If an athlete decides to supplement their diet to address their immune system and to support their immune system, that's okay. It's not. It's something that many athletes are doing. The safe way to do it is to use products that are approved for use in sport, and that can be checked out at a website. There's several websites, and I don't have them listed in this PowerPoint, but there's several websites online where you can check to make sure that the products you're taking are approved for use in sport. And if anybody is interested in giving their athlete more information about that, you can send me an email and I'll forward you the list of the websites. So my email, and for any questions that you have related to this topic at all, but also for the doping control, and my email address is watsonkaren@shaw.ca. And I'll give you the link for the websites where they can get information about safe supplements to use. And then the last thing is the travel tips. When athletes are going to competitions, they're often traveling, sometimes a long distance to get there, sometimes by plane. And there's a whole list of travel tips information you can get for athletes online. But the main point that I want to make is that you take this into consideration, that there's a plan for rest, that athletes travel rested, so that they're not spending so much time getting ready and making everything right at work and right at home that they are exhausted when they get on the road to go to their competition. Arriving rested is going to make the fatigue management during the competition so much easier. So we've done repair. We're going to talk about refuel. So refuel is not just about easing hunger and quenching thirst. It's about actually providing fuel to the body to address fatigue and to address repair and to address the immune system. So if athletes are just drinking when they're thirsty or eating when they're hungry, they're probably not eating and drinking in a way that's providing the kind of replenishment that their body needs in terms of fatigue management and recovery and repair. So what works? Well, having a competition meal plan. The first thing that I suggest to teams and athletes is that you figure out when to have your large meals and when to have your light meals. So by a large meal, I'm meaning one that we would normally consider a dinner, where you would sit down with a plate of meat, potatoes, and vegetables. I know that's a stereotypical dinner, but you know what I mean. It's a larger meal, whether it be pasta or whatever, but some kind of large meal with protein and vegetables and usually some kind of pasta or starch. So I would consider that a large meal. Now, light meals are, if I equate that to something like a breakfast or soup and sandwich. So if I call that a light meal. So then the question is, when do you have those meals? And usually for us in curling, the competition draw dictates when you can plan for large and light meals. So oftentimes there's not enough time during the day to actually have a large meal, especially on days where there's a triple knockout format, where you don't know when your gaps are going to be and when you're going to have enough time to get away to have a large meal. The athletes are often going with just light meals, so they're catching meals between games. So from that perspective, we normally talk about, or most people have 3 meals a day, 1 large meal and 2 light meals. If it's a competition day where the competitions are back-to-back, or there are times throughout the day so that if you had a large meal, you might feel uncomfortable or might not have the right energy available during a game, it might be easier for the athlete to have 4 light meals a day. So the rule of thumb that I talk to athletes about in terms of assisting their body with rest and recovery and fatigue management is to have, if you're going to have a day without a large meal, that then you have 4 light meals during that day. That may mean that there's a light meal after the last game of the day. So you may have an evening draw, and your light meal may be in the evening when you're doing your team meeting at the hotel, for example. So that might include bagels and cream cheese, cereal and toast, something that can be prepared at the hotel, and I would consider that your 4th meal of the day. So one thing that happens, and I'm going to assume that the athletes in Ontario are the same as the athletes that I've worked with here in BC. I've done an analysis of the competition meal plans for athletes, and I've, especially women athletes, and especially teenagers who like junior female athletes. I've also done the men, but what I found is the men usually eat enough during the day where they gain enough calories to provide the energy that they need, both for the actual exertion and the rest and recovery. What I found with the female athletes, and when I analyzed their competition meal plans, is that almost all of them were not eating enough calories to even provide a number of calories required on a 2 to 3 game competition day, let alone having enough calories to be able to provide what's needed for the repair and recovery that's needed between games, or to meet the needs of the body for rest and recovery. So I would, if you're working with female athletes, I would encourage you to do an analysis of the competition meal plan, and an honest analysis, like have them be honest about what they're eating, and ensure that there's enough calories being eaten to both energize the competition, but also to energize the recovery between competitions or between games. Another thing that really works is to do the meal planning and bring food to the venue so that you're not dependent on the time between games of, there's so much to do. If you pre-order the meals or bring food to the venue, it allows more time for rest and recovery. So if the food eating and the food going and getting food takes up less time between games, then you have more time for the rest part of the important fatigue management recovery phase. And then, of course, post-game, to have food within 30 minutes is so important to start that body, to start the muscles in repair. So our research has shown that carbohydrates and protein within 30 minutes of exertion, whether it be a workout or a game, a curling game, or any kind of exertion, eating within 30 minutes dramatically improves the rate of recovery. So if you're not going to curl for another 48 hours, then it doesn't really matter so much if you do it within 30 minutes of your game, because you've got within the 24 to 48 hours that you have before your next game, your body and your muscles will have time to recover. But because you don't have 2 days during a competition before your next game, that's why the 30 minutes window is so important. It just boosts the recovery dramatically. So what kind of carbs are required within the first 30 minutes? Well, we say 25 to 100 grams. So this chart just gives you an example of what 25 to 100 grams of carbohydrates looks like. So I want you to notice one thing, and that is that, a granola bar in itself might only be 16 grams, but if you add something else to it, like a drink of chocolate milk, which is a great thing because it also has protein in it, or a few raisins, for example, over here, that can bring it up to the 25 to 100 grams. So the size of the athlete, it was what determines whether they need 25 grams of carbs or 100 grams of carbs. So the larger stature the athlete is, or the more muscles the athlete has in terms of their shape, the more carbohydrates are needed within that first 30 minutes. And then protein is important for muscle repair as well. So here's an example, or examples of how much protein are in typical foods that might be eaten after a game. And 15 to 50 grams is what's recommended. This all doesn't have to be eaten within the first 30 minutes. The carbohydrates is the most important part, but some protein at this point is very useful for muscle repair. And the type of protein also matters. So the quality of proteins or whole proteins are, going to help the body repair faster. There is one caveat to all this for whatever foods are used, both for break foods and for post-game foods, and also for foods between games in your competition plan. And that is that whole foods are always the best source of carbohydrates and protein. So relying on sports drinks or relying on protein bars are not as good as being able to get your vitamins and minerals from a fresh food source. First of all, the fresh foods or the whole foods provide a double whammy. So you'll get the protein and the carbohydrates, but you also get immune boosting properties of vitamins and minerals, for example, vitamin C. So it's a win-win that way. And then the other thing is that a lot of those bars, whether they're the protein bars, the granola bars, or those kinds of things, they often are very high in refined sugars, which are not healthy for the athlete on the long term. They might provide a carbohydrate boost on the short term, but it's not considered as an effective source of sugars as a piece of fruit or something that has other attributes around vitamins and minerals. And what doesn't work, I think this is, I don't have to say, is just fast carbohydrates or eating too much refined sugar. It causes the glycogen in the body to jump really high, and after that, there's a real crash. Now, the time of day when we say to athletes is the time to have their 5 to 10% of fun food, if you will, is the period of time when they want to actually rest. So before they go to bed at night is the time to have their favorite donut or their favorite ice cream or their favorite bag of candy, because it will cause their blood sugar to go really high, and when the blood sugar crashes, then they'll be able to fall asleep. So if there's any time during their day in a competition where they are going to get into something like this, and if you're coaching teenagers, this is something that comes up frequently, then encourage them to do it before they go to bed, when the crash that they're going to have will actually work in their favor and help them sleep. These kinds of carbohydrates aren't as good for muscle repair because they are not maintained in the body long enough to actually help with the repair process, because it's a jumps very high and then jumps very low. So it's not as good for muscle repair as the slow carbohydrates. So we've talked about repair and refuel. I want to talk about rehydrate. So to replace, it's important to replace 150% of what is lost. Now, some of the sweepers are sweating quite a bit out on the ice. And if you want to test your sweepers to see how much they sweat, you can weigh them right before the game and weigh them right after the game and see how much water they've lost, how much weight they've lost, how much did they sweat out. So if they've sweat and lost a kilogram of weight, that means they've lost a liter of sweat. And the minimum that they need to consume to replace that is 150% of what they lost, so that's 1.5 liters of fluid. Now, if you're going to do this test, don't let them drink during the time that you're doing the test, because if they drink during that test period, they're already taking in something to replace. So if you want to test it, you have to test it with them without them drinking during the game, and see how much they lost during that time. And some of the athletes might be interested in doing that just as an experiment. So why is hydration important? Again, it's not just for how thirsty someone feels. It's because there's small amounts of salt and potassium and things like that in your body fluids, and the water carries those electrolytes through your body. And so being well hydrated allows those things to circulate more effectively. And water and electrolytes are important to exercise performance. They help maintain the blood volume and the oxygen to the brain and to the muscles, helps remove waste and toxins in the system. They help with nerve conduction and muscle function, regulates body temperature, replenish energy stores, balance metabolites and enzymes in the system, and helps with shock absorbing and lubricating properties. So this is a diagram to show what happens if somebody becomes dehydrated. And dehydration can happen in the body, not just through exercise, but exercise will make it happen faster. But cold, just being in a cold environment, can lead to dehydration. Heat is not something we usually have a problem with, but in some of the arenas where some of our athletes are competing, they get quite warm. That's why they're sweeping with just their t-shirts on, and they're still sweating. So they can be producing their own heat. We don't deal with altitude too much in curling, but the travel that people do before they come to event, especially if they don't get to the event, if they arrive at the event right before it starts, they may already be in a state of dehydration. So these are the kinds of symptoms that you would see if someone is dehydrated. So sleep disorders, poor concentration, irritability, depression, fatigue, poor appetite, and then trouble, again, their circadian rhythm is off, so they're not feeling awake when they should be. Their muscle force and muscle power can be affected from dehydration. Their skill and endurance can be affected. So all these functions are a result of being well hydrated. So this is why these items at the bottom is why hydration is so important. It's important to be able to explain this to athletes and for athletes to understand that it's not just about quenching your thirst. It's even for skips, it's about brain function. I've had some skips come off the ice and been totally exhausted. Well, they probably haven't been hydrating. They think because they don't sweep and they don't sweat that hydration is not as much of an issue for the skip as it is for the other athletes. But they're in a cold environment, and some of our female athletes, especially in, we're not all playing in arenas. Some curling clubs are very cold, and skips get very cold. Well, when they're fighting that, they're becoming dehydrated, and then their brain cognition is affected by that. So hydration is just as important for the skips as it is for the sweepers. So what works with hydration? Well, of course, water is one thing. Sports drinks, juice, and chocolate milk. Now, the chocolate milk is usually consumed after the event, but it can help rehydrate between. What doesn't work is alcohol, caffeine, and energy drinks, and the reason is that these actually aren't hydrating drinks. They're drinks, they are fluid, but they actually are dehydrating. So they will contribute to dehydration because they contribute to the body getting rid of more fluid than it's taking in. Now, I'm often asked about sports drinks and juice. one of the reasons why sport drinks and juice are recommended is because not only does it replace the water or the fluids that have been lost through sweat, but they also replace some of the electrolytes that have been lost through sweat. So the reason why sport drinks are recommended is because it replaces not just water, but also electrolytes. If athletes are uncomfortable using sport drinks or they don't like sport drinks, then what you can do is use juice that's watered down 50% and then add a touch of salt to it to replace the electrolytes that have been lost. So rather than just drinking straight juice, water it down to about 50% and use a pinch of salt to replace the electrolytes. So we've done repair, refuel, rehydrate. Next, I want to talk about rest. So again, this is an individual thing, and it's hard for athletes to sometimes judge whether they've gotten enough rest or not. Verbally, they may be able to say whether they feel rested or not, but that doesn't always tell you whether the body has actually had enough rest to recover from the exertion of the games and the competition. So looking at other measures for whether there's been enough rest is useful. So how long does it take the athlete to regain their resting heart rate? The longer it takes, then the longer rest period is required in order for the body to return to that normal status or normal condition. What's the quality of sleep like for the athlete? Are they feeling rested after they sleep? Are they feeling rested when they get up in the morning? How much fatigue are they reporting? How much fatigue are they showing out on the ice? Are they sitting down between ends or at the fourth end, as well, not the fourth end break, but at the break? Sitting down is quite appropriate during the break, but sitting down between ends, that's a sign of excess fatigue. Leaning on things, leaning on the wall, those kinds of things, and then just complaining about fatigue. How is their performance? Does it dip in the second half of the game? If you monitor their performance through the games over time, can you see a trend? Is there a trend that on the second game of the day, their performance is lower than the first game of the day? Or is it during the second half of the game versus the first half of the game? How is their performance affected by their fatigue? And then emotional stability. I think it's something that may not be attributed to their fatigue. It may be contributed to their personality or the stress of the game, but it could be that it's just a matter of not giving themselves enough time to rest and recover, and that's contributing to their emotional state of mind. So what works? Well, between games, rest may be just relaxation. It could be that the athlete doesn't have time, first of all, if there's not a long period between games, but also some people don't feel like they need a nap or aren't comfortable napping between games. So for those athletes, it's more talking about relaxation. What I highly recommend to athletes is that if they are going to just do relaxation and not actually take a nap, that they relax with their eyes closed. And the reason is to reduce the stimulation of their nervous system that they get from having their eyes open. Even if you're just sitting reading a book especially if you're reading a computer or reading your phone, your brain is being stimulated. And that nervous stimulation will be a barrier to rest and recovery. It'll be a barrier to allowing your body to repair and for your immune system to repair between games. So I encourage athletes, if they're just going to use relaxation, that they find a quiet place in the club, set their alarm on their phone for 10 minutes, and then just sit quietly in that space with their eyes closed for that period of time. And that process of reducing the stimulation to their nervous system will increase their recovery during that period dramatically. For athletes that do have time or that go back to their hotel or that want to take a nap, it's recommended that the nap be less than 30 minutes, so anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And the reason for that is so that the athlete doesn't move into REM sleep, so that they don't go into a deep sleep, because once you're in a deep sleep, the recovery process from that takes much longer. So it's recommended that athletes set an alarm on their phone to make sure that if they fall asleep, they only stay asleep for a maximum of 30 minutes. The problem with going into the REM sleep is it takes the brain waves into a different state, and to do that between games is a challenge because you don't usually have enough time to come out of it. So they could come out of that deep sleep if they've slept for an hour, for example. They could come out of it feeling less ready to play and less prepared for competition than before they had the nap. It actually will work against them. The other thing that's a problem with a nap that's too long is that it makes the sleep at night more difficult and less restful. So getting a good night's sleep is so important that having a long nap during the day might deter that. And then at the end of the day, having a routine that allows for the athlete to fall asleep. So this is where I already mentioned. It might include having a snack during the debrief at the hotel so that they get their last meal of the day. That snack could be one that has more fast carbohydrates so that it actually gives them a sugar high, and then when they crash, that'll help them fall asleep. Usually some kind of routine in terms of reading or listening to music, something where the stimulation slows down. It's recommended that there be no blue screen time during the 30 minutes before they try to fall asleep. So that means no computer, no TV for about 30 minutes before they hope to fall asleep. Because the stimulation to their nervous system will make falling asleep harder. So that becomes part of the bedtime routine to cut that out for the 30 minutes before going to bed. So we've talked about repair, refuel, rehydrate, rest. Now I'm briefly going to talk about reheat. This isn't an issue for most of our athletes, but I just put it in here because, if you're working with wheelchair athletes, working with some junior athletes, especially young kids that may not be moving around as much on the ice, especially the skips, this might be an issue. It's, again, something that may be dependent on where you are. I know that in some curling clubs, especially for playdowns, they may be in very cold places. It's quite common for the skips to have hand warmers in their pockets. It's just important that as a coach or as an athlete that you be prepared for this kind of need. So to go to the event with the supplies that you need. The main thing with the reheat is what doesn't work. So there should be 100% rule, no hot tubs, no saunas, no hot baths in between games or before games. That if that kind of activity is going to be engaged in, that it be done at the end of the day. It would be a good thing to help with the bedtime routine, because falling asleep and these kinds of activities tend to assist you in falling asleep, and that's the reason why it's not recommended during the day or between games. It just isn't a total energy drain, and it's extremely difficult to get reactivated, before the game. So with all the these rest and reheat, these last two items, reactivation is super important. So whatever kind of rest is engaged in, or if somebody has a shower or just uses a magic bag to get warmed up, it's important to reactivate before going anywhere near the next game. So that means doing a good warm-up, doing some kind of mental stimulation like playing a game of cards or playing a board game with the team, playing hacky sack outside of the curling club, those kinds of things to reactivate after a rest. I put this slide in here to show you what a competition plan could look like that includes all the elements that have been mentioned here. So this is one that was done for the National Team Program, and it was one that was done for the last Olympics, for taking the teams to the Olympics. So you can see it was a 2-game day. There was all the elements of the competition plan were put on this one page for that one day. So there was time for a large meal, but the gap was so big that they needed another light meal. There was breakfast. The snacks are listed out. Time for relaxation and reset is the reactivation that I mentioned. Time for a nap. Time for mental recovery. And then being prepared to sleep. So all these things are an important part of a successful competition. This is just a creative way that was found to present it to the athletes in a way that was meaningful and could see at a glance all the elements that we've just been talking about. So now I'd like to go back and talk about what you do between competitions. And this is important because if you do this part well, then when you get to the competition, fatigue management is much easier because a successful rehab and rejuvenation between events means the athlete's in the best condition possible to be able to do the rest and recovery that's required during the competition. So rehabilitation doesn't have to be a formal going to a physiotherapist or doing formal rehab. It can be informal things like getting a massage, doing an acupuncture, or getting physiotherapy. I threw in here a discussion about compression socks because it's a way that some athletes are between, for when they're exercising, helping keeping their muscles toned and are finding it as a means to keep their system active. And so I just put it in there as another example. I just wanted to mention examples of ways that athletes can work between events to get back into shape and to reduce the impact of the injury that they may have had through physiotherapy, or to just rejuvenate through massage or through running or whatever. And then rejuvenate. This is the most important part. Take recovery days so that right after an event, the 2 or 3 days after an event, rather than going out and playing other league games or doing going to the gym, those are important as recovery days. Just giving the body a total time to physically recover from the event. Maintain a physical training program through the season rather than just doing it in the off season, so that games are not enough to maintain a physical stamina that is important for competitions. So also doing some kind of maintenance physical training session. And then the most important thing is to manage stress. So this is taken from an employment perspective, but it works exactly the same for our athletes. It's important that this time between events be a time to put stress into perspective and to be in this area in the middle where stress is managed, so that if the athlete's over in the distressed area, then more activities or calming activities are required to bring it into balance, to bring stress into balance. There will always be stress. So talking about athletes about how they manage bad stress and how they manage stress is an important function. It's important to manage the stress into this optimal performance area. So these are the kinds of activities that are useful in managing stress. These are just examples. Every athlete's going to have their own methods. Sometimes it could be just listening to music. Sometimes it can be taking a mini vacation. Sometimes it can be organizing their work so that they are more organized at work and then less stress when they're away at competitions. Sometimes it means working with their family to find a way for their family to support them and to deal with family issues so that they feel less stressed when they leave town for a weekend. So managing stress is one of the key ways for addressing the time between games and to reduce the stress on the immune system and to allow the body the best opportunity to recover from the competition. So just to recap, we've talked about repair, refuel, rehydrate, rest, reheat, rehab, and rejuvenate. And I call those the R's of recovery. And I'm open to any questions that you have about fatigue management and rest and recovery.
Unmute the group.
Okay.
So that on TV.
Hey everybody, you're unmuted, so please try to keep the background noise to a minimum. Does anybody have any questions, please?
You can also type in chat.
Yeah. I have one. Karen, do you know much about the caffeine consumption, like almost the caffeine power naps where they suggest taking caffeine 20 minutes or like just before a nap and then you sleep through it and wake up even more alert?
Yes, it is something that's being suggested now. The idea is that it takes a while for the caffeine to get in your system, so that especially if you have a short period of time for your rest, it allows the caffeine to be there when you need it when you wake up. So if you woke up and then had your caffeine, it might take too long to get into your system for it to really benefit you, especially if you just have a short period of time. I mean, if you've got a couple hours, it doesn't really matter if you do it that way. But the shorter period of time you have, then that's when it becomes useful. So it takes about 20 minutes for your body to absorb the caffeine. So that's why it's suggested that you do it that way. It'll also probably help you with this idea of the short nap, so that because it's a point where the caffeine's going to kick in that might actually help you wake up at that point, which is the 20 to 30 minute point.
Good. And I had a coach this week. We were consulting our nutritionist at the CSIO about the types of food or the quantity, I guess, more or less, that a junior girls team might need during a game. So he was concerned the team was using or was drinking 2 large Gatorades a game and eating, in his words, a buffet at the 5th end break, right? So he was a little, concerned and needed to bring in some outside expertise to address the concerns. But is there any kind of recommendation to quantity of those fluids during the game, or the smorgasbord that seems to be happening?
Well, that's a lot of Gatorade for one game. I guess my rule of thumb had been that 1 Gatorade was enough per a curling game. I guess my challenge to that coach would be, what's the other food that's happening in the day? I would never look at that in isolation to answer that question, because it would seem like if that's happening, then there hadn't been enough consumed at other times during the day if that was really felt to be necessary. Now, one thing that I do recommend to athletes about this, when the timing of meals, I'll give you an example. If someone has breakfast at 7 o'clock and they've got a 10 o'clock game and they get to the curling club by 9 and they start their warm-up, by the time they get on the ice for the 10 o'clock game, they've lost all the benefit of the carbohydrates they had at that 7 or 7:30 a.m. meal. So I think what's happening sometimes to our athletes is that they don't realize that they've lost the benefit of the carbohydrate they had in that meal if it's too far in advance, or that they haven't had enough. We've been telling athletes to eat a couple hours before, make sure they've got that 2 hours, but sometimes that 2 hours stretches into 3 before the game starts. So I always suggest to athletes that if it's been more than 2 hours since you had a meal, that you have one of your break snacks or a light snack before the game actually starts. Then maybe there wouldn't be the same need for that kind of quantity during the game. It does sound like too much. I think the other thing that I recommend is that there not be a huge amount at the break. I recommend that that there be an emphasis more on a level, keeping a level of carbohydrate relatively even through the games rather than this big spike at the break. So that would mean doing things like the gel packs or having the one Gatorade, I don't know about 2 Gatorades, but something where you sip it through the game and then have, a small amount to supplement during the break. But I think the main thing is to make sure you've had enough carbohydrates between games so that isn't necessary to have that quantity. I'm surprised they don't rush to the bathroom every second end at that rate.
They're young.
Yeah, I don't know.
Anybody else have any questions? I could pick Karen's brain forever here.
You said something about the caffeine. Sort of sounded like, a nap and some caffeine in between games or something. But you also mentioned earlier about, caffeine was not something good in terms of rehydration. So, yes or no in terms of something like coffee?
I've never suggested to athletes that they not drink coffee. What I say is that don't consider that to be part of your rehydration plan. So if you're drinking coffee, it actually means that you need more water and other sources of fluids to compensate for the fact that you drank coffee. So because you drank the coffee, you need another full glass of water to compensate for the fact you drank a coffee. So it's okay to have it, but you need not part of your rehydration plan.
Okay.
Good question. Anything else?
While we're talking about that, the reason why energy drinks are totally not recommended is because of the level of caffeine that are in them. I don't know if everybody is familiar with energy drinks. Energy drinks are not the same as sport drinks. And it's the high level of caffeine that's in them that is considered to be the problem.
If a team were to be doing some international travel, do you recommend they do any sleep training before they go there?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you clearly, but was that sleep training?
Well, yeah, sorry, like trying to adjust their clocks and their circadian rhythms, really, right? So
yeah, I think I do recommend it to a degree. I don't say. I mean, you can go online and see the plan, where they say for every zone, you get up an hour earlier or whatever. But I suggest to athletes that the main thing they do is get on the time zone as soon as they get on the plane, get on that time zone for where they're going in terms of the sleep they allow themselves on the plane. That's one thing. And when they eat, which is sometimes difficult because they feed you when they want to feed you, but the sleep part you have more control of. And then that you do a little bit of the sleep training before you go. So, not to getting up 4 hours in advance per se, but, getting up earlier in the morning for the week before you go, sort of every day getting up a little bit earlier. But I don't suggest they go to an extreme because it creates other problems and with your life that you have to deal with. So I think a little bit of that, but the main thing is when you get on the plane, switch to the new time zone right away.
Right. Good.
Question. If they have the kids, let's say, have a night game, like a 9 o'clock game, and let's say they didn't play since later in the afternoon or something, do you think it's a good idea for them to sit down for, a large meal, 7 o'clock sort of thing, maybe up to a couple hours before, and then play, or should they, will that make them tired for the later game, or should they just stick to more like a later meal?
My rule of thumb with teams has been if you have the time, the large meal is a good thing. Getting the calories from it and the nutrients that you need from that meal is a useful thing. And so I do tell them if they have enough time to get the large meal. The question is, and this varies by type of athlete and type of team. So I've worked with female athletes where large meals looked very different than when I was working with teenage junior boys. And that's okay. And the amount of time that it took and how much time they needed from the meal until when they played was different. I had junior boys where they could have hamburger and fries about an hour before they played and they were still hungry. But I couldn't do that with a female junior girls team. So I think it's very individual, but there's no reason not to. And I encourage them to have a large meal if they have enough time. I would do it as soon after the previous game as possible. So what I would recommend is you come off the afternoon game, get the large meal as soon as possible. Make that the first thing you do. Then have the rest period and then a reactivation period. And then if it's been more than 2 to 3 hours since you ate, then have a quick snack, like just a piece of fruit or something before the game actually starts at 9 o'clock. Whoa.
Karen, can you speak to doing other activities other than curling during your competition time? Like I know Carrie Galusha had a great story this year when she came to the Scotties. It was her best finish ever. And she usually used the Scotties as a trip away, and they would take every moment they could to see all the sights in the city and make sure they got to the shopping malls and whatever. But this past year, their coach who was John Epping kind of put a stop to all that and said, no, you're here to curl, and they use their time for rest and recovery versus sightseeing and shopping. And as a result, had a much better performance result. Can you kind of maybe speak to what some of the top teams are doing?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One is that if it depends on your draw. If you've got enough time for rest and recovery and a little bit of the other, then it's okay. But what often happens is you don't have enough time for the rest and recovery. And so that other becomes A, a distraction, and B, it drains energy and doesn't allow for muscle repair and recovery. The other thing is that it's the type of activity might make a difference. So, there's a difference between going to a movie versus going to walk around a mall in terms of the amount of energy and the stimulation and everything that's involved in that activity. So I think choosing activities, if you are going to do something, if there's a big gap, choosing activity that's more restful than one that's more energizing. It just is about giving your muscles a chance to use the energy to repair rather than using the energy to be stimulated or using the energy to do some kind of exercise. So focusing the energy on repair rather than focusing the energy on other things.
Yeah. Thanks. Does anybody else have any questions? Going once.
Somebody's asked questions about meal replacement drinks. I actually, again, this is very athlete specific, but I have athletes that I have carried and always carried meal replacement drinks with us. I've had athletes who find it difficult to eat solid foods when they're anxious. And for those athletes, I highly recommend the meal replacement drinks. You have to eat something of value to your system for carbohydrates and vitamins and minerals, and those meal replacement drinks have them. And for some athletes, it's easier for them to consume fluids than it is to consume solid foods. So any athlete that has any kind of queasy stomach or doesn't like eating in the morning, doesn't usually eat breakfast, those kinds of athletes, those drinks are really highly recommended. And then the other question had been about the small quantity of snack for the break. I do think that trying to maintain the level of carbohydrate over the game is more important than a spike at the break. But it all depends on the athletes. Again, if you've got a large athlete or you've got a teenager that's growing, they're going to have more than someone who's not in that phase of their lives. Yes, it's fine to share the PowerPoints. Jen has them, so she can share them with people if they're interested in that.
Do you have a recommendation there on the brand of meal replacement drinks?
No, they're all the same. You know, the Ensure Boost, that's what we're talking about. The ones that come, and the great thing about them is that you don't have to refrigerate them. I mean, they taste better if they're refrigerated, but you don't have to refrigerate them, so they're easy to carry. They are really, and you can buy them when you get there. They're in every store now. You can get them anywhere. So they are a good backup for. I try to always have some just in case someone goes sideways. So I always have 1 or 2 bottles of those meal replacement drinks when I travel as a coach, just in case someone starts to go queasy on me or something goes sideways. For the amount of money it costs, it's a good thing to have. I consider it a good thing to have in my pack. So a question about fruits like grapes too high in sugar. Sugar is actually, I mean, carbohydrates are sugar. So when we're talking about having carbohydrates and needing carbohydrates within 30 minutes after a game or wanting to maintain the carbohydrate level during a game, the reason why we're talking about carbohydrates are the only thing that provide your body with immediate energy. So when you're burning energy during a game, it's only carbohydrates that are providing that energy. So sugars for an athlete are actually a good thing because sugars are a source of carbohydrates. And grapes and melons and strawberries and all those things, they're not refined sugars. Those are natural sugars. So yes, they are high in sugars. If you're on a weight loss program, you wouldn't want to be eating a lot of them. But athletes should not be considering weight loss as an issue during a competition. They should only be considering having enough energy to compete. And so these sugars actually become an important source of energy. And yes, there's no reason not to use all those fruits either at the break or in the 30 minutes after the game. They're a good source of carbohydrates. Okay, good, thanks.
Excellent. Last chance for any questions. Karen, thank you very much. This has been excellent.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.
I'll send out the presentation to everybody and sure. Probably a copy of the recording along with it. So thanks, Karen.
Okay, take care.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
And then, so banana got on the floor, so I need a clone.
Okay. Where is, where are pants?
I don't have it.
You got lots in your drawer.
Mommy?
Yeah. Thanks for being so quiet, guys.
I'm kind of home.